Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. This week we're looking at some of the commanders from the new Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and today this is going to be Kaervek the Punisher. So Kaervek the Punisher is a mono-black commander. He's a 3-mana 3/3, and it says whenever you commit a crime, exile up to one target black card from your graveyard and copy it. You may cast the copy. If you do, you lose 2 life. Of course, for those not familiar, committing a crime is targeting an opponent, anything they control, including spells on the stack, and or cards in their graveyards. So obviously this deck is going to be wanting to do a few things. It's going to want lots of targeted effects that allow the commit a crime trigger of Kaervek to go off. It's going to want lots of cheap cards that you can reuse with Kaervek from the graveyard. It's going to want cards that can repeatedly target things either over and over, or can target things for very cheaply or free. And finally, it's going to want some amount of life gain to mitigate the life that you're losing off of casting things from the graveyard. So unfortunately, the cards in the deck don't really neatly fall into specific categories, so let's go through them kind of one at a time. So we've got cards like Aphotic Wisp, Cling to Dust, Cremate, Dark Blast, Mishra's Bauble, Night Haze, and Urza's Bauble. So of course, these are all cheap target spells that can commit crimes and can also be, of course, reused from the graveyard for very cheap, other than obviously Mishra's Bauble and Urza's Bauble, although these are 0 mana ways of committing a crime. So for example, let's say you use Night Haze, you target something, you get to commit a crime via Kaervek, which allows you to cast something else for cheap from the graveyard. And then, once Night Haze is in your graveyard, the next time you commit a crime, you'll be able to cast Night Haze, which will allow you to target and then draw another card, meaning that you've just spent a total of 2 mana to draw 2 cards, and you've managed to commit a crime twice off of just the Night Haze, which presumably allowed you to cast other spells, and this is true for all of these cards. Dark Blast in particular is worth pointing out, as this is the one out of these cards that doesn't actually specifically allow you to draw a card when you cast it. However, you do get to dredge the Dark Blast, meaning that you can use it over and over, and the dredge may incidentally mill other black cards into your graveyard. Then we've got some generic card draw spells in black, of course, things like Bolas' Citadel, Necropotence, the One Ring, and Night's Whisper, specifically in this deck, which is particularly good for being a cheap card that you get to recast off of Kaervek. Although losing 2 from the Night's Whisper, then losing 2 from Kaervek, and losing another 2 from the Night's Whisper does add up, which is why, as I said earlier, Kaervek is going to need a lot of life gain in order to mitigate the massive amount of life that you're going to lose by casting so many spells off of the commit a crime trigger. Reanimate is, of course, good as Reanimate always is, but in particular, any of these targeted reanimation spells can also commit crimes. So I just have Reanimate in this deck, but you could supplement with things like Animate Dead and Dance of the Dead if you wanted to go for a more Reanimate-centric route, or just have more of those kinds of cards in the deck. Removal, and especially single target removal, is going to be much better in Kaervek than it is usually, specifically because, again, you can use these to trigger the commit a crime and then cast other spells from your graveyard, or any commit a crime spell can then cast the removal as well. So we're going to have cards like Cut Down, Deadly Rawlook, Dismember, although again, if you're paying the life off of the Phyrexian mana plus Kaervek's 2 life trigger, this is going to add up. Fatal Push, Feed the Swarm, Go for the Throat, Orcish Bowmasters, of course, and Snuff Out. You could, of course, play more removal spells, but I felt like this was a good amount and probably the best ones. There are obviously tons of 2 mana destroy a creature with some sort of restriction spells in black. I felt like Go for the Throat was probably the best one out of them, but you could change it if you wanted or play more. We're going to have some stacks effect. Being in mono black, we do need ways of dealing with what our opponents are doing, and thankfully Kaervek and the strategy around him lends himself pretty well to applying to these stacks cards. So you've got Curse Totem to shut off activated abilities, which then immediately conflicts with Dauthi Voidwalker, but Dauthi Voidwalker is, I believe, the only card in the deck that is going to be countered by Curse Totem. Dauthi Voidwalker, Opposition Agent, Bowmasters, Sheoldred, and Torpor Orb. Again, Torpor Orb probably only stops Orcish Bowmasters and basically nothing else in the deck. And then particular, Relic of Progenitus and Scrabbling Claws. So these are cheap ways of being able to repeatedly target your opponent every single turn, allowing you to commit crimes with these over and over. And of course, they're just incidentally graveyard hate. Obviously not very good graveyard hate, which is why they usually don't show up in other decks. But in this deck particularly, when you can just pay 1 mana, commit a crime, and then on future turns commit crimes again every time you tap these, they get a lot better. And if for whatever reason you don't want to use them to commit crimes, they do just cycle themselves away. A little bit of sweeping in Damnation and the Meat Hook Massacre. Meat Hook Massacre here primarily because of the life gain clause, which allows you to get back some of that life gain that you're losing off of Kaervek's trigger. A couple of tutors, And then some uncategorized cards that are specifically good in Kaervek for what we're doing. So again, like Relic and Scrabbling Claws, Codex Shredder, Glasses of Urza, and Hex Parasite are all cards that can target for cheap or free in the case of these two. And Surgical Extraction is a way to get the trigger with just a 2-life payment off of the Surgical using the Phyrexian mana, or you could pay black if you don't want to pay the life. Finally, Exsanguinate. This is usually a finisher in decks, but in this deck in particular, you can use it to just mitigate some of the life loss. So while you could use it to win the game, you can also use it for less mana just to recoup all of the life that you're losing. Moving back up here, we've got our combos. So the easiest combo to slot in was going to be Aetherflux Reservoir, Sensei's Divining Top, and Bolas's Citadel. This is just, we're going to play Citadel anyway. We want to gain life anyway. May as well just slot this in. Obviously, you're going to be doing a lot of value generation with Kaervek, but we do need a way to ultimately win the game. If you're not so keen on having infinite combos in your deck, you could just easily cut the Reservoir and the top. Then Grey Merchant as a way to, again, gain a bunch of life. And like Exsanguinate, you can use it to potentially win the game, although you will need a lot of devotion in order to do that. And this deck is mostly interested in playing a bunch of cheap spells that are not sticking around. There are some ways of reusing the Grey Merchant. If it dies, you can get it back with Reanimate. You can also just get it back with Kaervek, although that means you won't be able to get it back again. But ultimately, this card is going to function one of two ways. Either it is going to be able to actually do enough life drain in order to kill the opponents, or more likely, it's just going to be a way to offset all of the life loss that you're incurring from Kaervek and the various other life loss spells like Necro, Citadel, Night's Whisper, etc. A little bit of fast mana. Now, this deck does not have the ability to just turbo out Kaervek and then win the game on that alone. However, what it does need is a way to get Kaervek onto the board and then have mana left over in order to start chaining Committed Crimes and spells afterwards, or just protect Kaervek from removal since the deck is revolving around Kaervek. So in this case, Dark Ritual and Jeweled Lotus just allow you to deploy a Kaervek without having to tap out all of your mana. Lightning Greaves for protection. And some more protection, of course, is going to be Cavern of Souls to prevent counters, Defense Grid, Imp's Mischief to redirect targets, and then Hand Disruption. Now, Hand Disruption does occasionally see play in EDH, but usually not. In this case, however, again, because all of these spells trigger the Commit a Crime part of Kaervek, you can use them to take apart players' combos, take apart players' answers to Kaervek ahead of time, and then you can use these once Kaervek's already in play to keep committing more crimes. Obviously, we're going to need a bunch of ramp. This is your typical assortment of ramp that's going to be in mono black, mostly 2 mono rocks. However, some of these do need to be talked about specifically because of their use in Kaervek. So in this case, some of the mono rocks actually target, which will allow you to generate the Commit a Crime trigger. So Liquid Metal Torque, you can target any artifact on the battlefield, not just your own. Same thing with Manifold Key and Voltaic Key, which are usually here to untap things like Mono Vault and the One Ring, but here your opponents are probably going to control artifacts of their own, and so you can use these as ways to commit crimes. Otherwise, fairly stock mono base, mostly mono black stuff. However, once again, some things do require speaking about in specific. So, Urborg, the original Urborg, has a tap ability. Target creature loses First Strike or Swamp Walk. Similarly, there are other lands that, again, allow you to commit crimes. So lands like Shizo, if your opponent controls a legendary creature. There may be others that you could play. These are the best ones that I found in mono black. So sometimes your lands will also allow you to commit crimes. Some more that I opted not to play were things like Cabal Pit, because again, I don't feel like it's that helpful given how many other ways you already have to commit crimes, and considering that cards like Cabal Pit cause you to lose life constantly, that life is going to add up a lot, again, especially with Kaervek's trigger, so I didn't want to have a million different things that are constantly draining your life. Things like Ancient Tomb are, of course, very, very good, and it's a good way to get ahead on another mana, but otherwise, it's probably better to stick with lands that are not going to hurt you. However, there is one exception, and that is in this deck, there are fetch lands. So the black fetch lands are going to be in this deck. The reason they're here is basically only for 2 things. You have Bolas's Citadel, which cares about what's on top of your deck, and you have Fatal Push, which cares about Revolt. Otherwise, there's no real reason to have these, and if you're playing on more of a budget, you definitely do not need these fetch lands in order to run the deck. And yeah, that is going to do it today for Kaervek the Punisher.